Okay. So I'm making this video to talk about the shoulder because I think it represents a few key characteristics that we find in like all across human anatomy, figure art, um, and it's complicated enough to cause enough people problems, like even myself, uh, because it's difficult to understand. And when you start digging into the literature and even see examples of people explaining it to you, it's like it's hard to help people grasp what's going on in like the dynamics of shoulder anatomy, how it moves the arm, what tissue does as the movement occurs, things like that. So this is me essentially blocking in ZBrush uh, just a basic maquette, you know, in a simple pose. But I like this pose for this purpose because it showed a couple different variations of the shoulder, right? One's pulled back and the other one's, protracted forward. And I think something to notice before we go into some more detail about this is just how few lines you generally need to use to describe this space or these structures. Uh, I first drew out the clavicle without much detail, right? Just, Bridgman's Cupid's bow type shape or an italicized F, going back there to the shoulder to the acromion. And then proceeding to draw back the spine of the scapula from the acromion, as well as wrapping up the pectoralis major on the chest, right? And I think that that's also an important point to make. Wrapping it up is it gets tricky when the shoulders move forward and when it's moved back. It kind of assumes a different shape, but it's always functioning on the same principle. And it's paralleled by the latissimus dorsi, which is the next line I drew right there behind it, which also spirals up and forward. And we'll look at some examples of this in a second. There I just touched the sternocleidomastoid, which is like the seat belt of the neck, right? Um, the trapezius muscle now kind of defining more the border of that scapula in the back. And don't worry if, you're not following any of this or maybe you're not familiar, but that's fine. Uh, I'll show you some actual examples from cadavers in anatomy and, some different poses from figure art. Yeah. Before moving on, also kind of touching those arm muscles because they are sort of inherently involved in the shoulder, right? If you think about the triceps, they're actually connected. Uh, one with the scapula, at least one head is, and then another through actual fascial adhesions, which I'll show you a great example of here in a little bit. But that comes into play a little bit more on the other arm since it's reached forward. You can see that a little bit better. All right, so basically just doing the same thing now, but for the other shoulder, defining that clavicle, and then defining the scapula in the armpit or the axillary fossa, sorry. But I guess one thing to take note is like this can all be built out and refined, ad nauseum to make it pretty, right? But at this level, I think the most important thing is like, to get those structures down and really to understand or have some familiarity with kind of the nature of what's happening, with shoulder musculature. And that's, if I can communicate a point in this video, that's going to be the one. So we notice this spiral characteristic, which occurs all over the body, in more places than not. The relationship between the muscles of the arm, muscles of the shoulder, chest, back. It's a very dynamic area, and I think that's why it's so complicated to understand, or at least like become familiar with, or even get used to not screwing up. So just defining some of that deltoid now. The deltoid, another kind of extrinsic muscle of the shoulders. And I'm going to use these words extrinsic and intrinsic because that's what people use. And really, it just defines muscles that are deeper to others. So muscles of the rotator cuff, those would be intrinsic. They lie in deeper fascial planes. They develop differently, or in, kind of a different layer, I guess, than muscles that we generally are familiar with a lot of names. So like you might not be familiar with infraspinatus, but you might be familiar with, your traps or your lats or your pecs. All right, let's kind of go through these things in series. Why did I start with the clavicle and why did I start with the, you know, scapula? Here's a great image. This is from Grey's Anatomy. This is, this line right here, it might look simplistic. It might look like it's not reflective of actual anatomy, but, all things considered, is actually very elegant. So you'll notice the trapezius is coming down and has a relationship here to the deltoid, or at least the anterior head of the deltoid there, the clavicular head. It's very beautiful. It has the swooping motion. Maybe keep that in mind along with the pectoralis major, because that's sort of the whole spiraling, twisting thing that's going on. But, I drew that out, right? Because I know that I'm going to be using it and I can refine it later and kind of bring it more into reality. But this is what we're talking about, right? This is a shoulder. And if you're not, very experienced with anatomy, you might recognize this, but you don't know where to start. And inevitably, we're going to start layering things like muscles and then fascia and fat, things like that on top of it. And it'll take on more of an appearance of something that resembles a person and what we actually are trying to produce or replicate in art. But, there's some, let me just say it like this here. Let's just look at this. So muscles coming off of the thorax, right? This is a render. This is from data, and you can't really see it because of how low resolution the data is. But if this is your pectoralis major, and the arms are raised above their head, we have fibers, well, that's the clavicle, but running up here into a space where it's been truncated. But you can kind of imagine that these fibers are coming up and spiraling around, and they kind of have that interplay along with latissimus dorsi, which is over here. I wish it was not so dark of a picture, but we have some actual cadaver photos that'll sort of help to explain this or drive this home. Here's a cadaver photo from Grey's Anatomy or McMinn's. I don't remember exactly, but here we have pectoralis major, and you can notice absolutely the fibers of this muscle as these clavicular fibers kind of come down and travel down onto the humerus. Pectoralis, the lower fibers, they rotate up, and this helps, do push-up. This helps us manipulate our humerus, right? From the anterior chest wall perspective. But this deltoid as well, it takes on this characteristic, which is the twisting, torquing kind of motion. And I see this constantly when I study anatomy. I think it's a feature of how we work rather than just an anomaly or anything like that. And it's probably less interesting than anything. But what's interesting from my perspective is that it helps us kind of gather how to understand these things. Here we go, the exact same thing coming around latissimus dorsi from the back. Look at all those nerves coming out. It's fantastic. But it's going to have that exact same spiral characteristic, and then it's going to meet up right here with the posterior aspect of the deltoid. Let's see. I have this great example of what I referred to earlier from your triceps muscle. This from Carlos Stecco's book on fascia, which is fantastic. But we have the triceps coming back here, and there's this fascial connection that, it juts off of the latissimus dorsi here. And it's really fantastic because we can absolutely use this to explain things that we see in models when we're, drawing or sculpting from life. As an example, right here. So, you might memorize all these muscles, the arms, but there's curves that are so fundamental to replicating the figure that we see so often. And this is one of them. So there's that fascial adhesion right there. Okay. And here's another view of the triceps and the deltoid. We have these fibers here. You'll notice again, they're just wrapping around so beautifully here. These ones coming all the way up and joining with the scapula. So that would be the long head of the triceps. The deltoid, you can see its kind of nature here. This is fantastic. In more developed deltoids, you can actually sort of see these fibers bulging out. It's not very common, but you can definitely see it. This is something to note, and we'll go into this in more detail when we talk about muscles specifically and the things they do. But when you're told that the deltoid terminates at the spine of the scapula, like this is what they're talking about. And sure, you can see, okay, so these are the fibers right here, right? But they're all of this white sort of fascia, pearlescent business going on. There's a lot going on underneath there, but that's the spine of the scapula, right? And so it's not necessarily this clean, delineated line that we can understand like all the time, So just be aware that there's a nuance there. And then one more. Here's a great picture from Carlos Decker's book, which I love. Pectoralis major, you can see that, kind of spiral characteristic there as its lower fibers are going up more superiorly to it, right? And then these clavicular fibers right here coming down, which if the arm was dropped would be more caudal or inferior on the arm. The brachial fascia running right into there. And there is a relationship between the pectoralis and the brachial fascia, just like posterior arm with the triceps. Yep. And there's that brachial plexus and all that axillary vasculature coming out there, being protected by its fascia. That's where it's coming from. That's how it gets to the arm. And latissimus dorsi coming up here, of course. Serratus anterior. Serratus anterior has a very interesting relationship with the shoulder. It's subtle, and actually, if we go back to the beginning here, where we were talking about Gray's anatomy, right here, we can see this ridiculous relationship that, hey, you don't think of serratus anterior right here on the anterior chest wall, right, pulling your shoulder forward, but it having a relationship with the middle of your back, but it does. You have these rhomboids, which are rarely, talked about, or you don't sculpt them, you don't draw them, you might have heard of them, but they're deep to a lot of muscles, so they don't really have any prominent effect. But why know them? Well, serratus anterior, making little fingerings that come out of here. Well, they join at the scapula back here, and if you really understand this relationship between where they originate and where these rhomboids insert, you'll really have a really great understanding of how the shoulder works and how we move the scapula around our body, around the chest. Yeah. So next we'll go into more detail about something, and yeah, I hope that was interesting.